Now, the first thing I would like to do is to talk a little about the difference between government and state. Government, ladies and gentlemen, has always existed. There have probably been very few societies, and those societies were very simple indeed, in which some people, usually but not always men, did not have power over other people. The first governments were a question of families, inside the family, elders ruling younger, men ruling women, and so on and so on. Later, this expanded in all kinds of ways so that you could have government even without or outside or beyond the family. So government is probably as old as we are as human beings. In some ways, you might say that even animals or some animals have government, insofar as not all individuals are equal, which is good, because if they had been equal, they would be fighting one another all the time for resources, for females. But some individuals, as among chimpanzees, are stronger, bigger, more intelligent than others. They run the community, if that is the right word. They govern the rest, again, if that is the right word. And this has, as I just said, probably existed right from the time that we lost our tails, stopped jumping on trees, and went down to the savannah. The state is something else. The word, more or less as we use it, and I don't have time for all of this, really started being used in the 16th century. If you read Machiavelli, you see something called lo Stato, the state. And if you read it carefully, you realize that by the state, Machiavelli meant the power mechanism through which rulers worked. The power mechanism through which the rulers worked. So, as he says, it was possible for a person to lose his state or to gain a new state. It was possible for him to wreck his state or to strengthen his state. It was the power mechanism, he couldn't do everything by himself, through which persons, princes, you might say, governed the subordinates. And sometime around 1600, you might say, this power mechanism started becoming more and more powerful. It started expanding. More and more bureaucrats made their appearance. People got to the point where, slowly but steadily, the power mechanism became stronger than the person who had it, the person who used it, the person who gave it orders. Because it was expanding, and the more bureaucrats there were, obviously, the more power they collectively acquired. And the more there were of them, the more important it was that they work by fixed rules. Because if a large body of people does not follow fixed rules, they cannot function at all. You will have chaos. And so, slowly, the bureaucracy, the power mechanism, became stronger than the ruler itself. Yes, the rulers in theory was always able to go around the bureaucracy, to give direct orders. But doing so, he risked throwing the entire machine into chaos. You could do it. Yes, you could do it. You could give orders. You could do all kinds of things. You could violate the rules. You could do it. But if you did that, then you would throw the whole, or you ran the risk of throwing the whole machine into chaos. But originally, to repeat, it was not like that, okay? The ruler, the king, the prince, the leader was everything. The army was his army. The roads were his roads. As in English, the king's highway. The treasury was his treasury. Not even Putin can say that the Russian treasury is his treasury, okay? Not even Putin can say that. But before about 1600, that was a matter of course. In this country, if I'm not mistaken, to this day, the Russian hymn is Save the Tsar. Is that correct? So that it was originally the personal song of the ruler. All this, as I tried to explain, started changing around 1600. And the reason why it changed was because the bureaucracy got so big, so complicated, so much governed by rules that it started putting the ruler in the shade. Now, this did not happen in one day, as you can well imagine. It took a long time. A decisive step was taken in 1652 when Thomas Hobbes, in his famous work, Leviathan, wrote, and I quote, that the state was an artificial person, an artificial man, okay, which was carried by the ruler. Nobody else had ever said something like that before. Okay? The state and the ruler were clearly separated for the first time. It was not just a question of ruler against ruler, ruler over subjects, but the ruler carrying the state, which was separate from him, an organization, an abstract entity on his shoulders. Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, 1652. At 1700, or thereabout, King Louis XIV of France could still say, "L'état c'est moi," the state is me. Wrong, Mr. King. Nobody, of course, would dare tell him so. The very fact that you can say so already shows that it's not true. L'état, c'est moi. There is l'état. There is moi, the great, great big moi. And no, they are no longer the same, even if you say so. At least that is the way I interpret things. About 50 years later, around 1750, Frederick the Great said, "I am the first servant of the state." The first servant of the state. Everybody serves the state, and I'm just the servant number one. So these 3 steps really sum up as briefly as possible the development of the state. States became powerful. Anybody knows when the word bureaucracy was invented? I'll tell you, I forget the name of the guy, he was French, sometime around 1760. Traditionally, as I'm sure many of you know, there used to be 3 forms of government. Monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, from Aristotle on. This guy, whose name I forget at the moment, but you can find it in my book, added a 4th element, bureaucracy, which in time proved to be much stronger than all the rest. It grew, it grew, it grew, and it grew. Now, this process started at one place. And that place was clearly, as the examples I just gave you show, Western Europe. And for Western Europe, mainly you could say England, France, Britain, I know less about France, it started expanding in all directions because Europe itself expanded. Whoever did not participate in the process, whoever did not reorganize and turn himself into a state was doomed. Of course, it was not the only reason why he was doomed, but they were doomed. A very good example is Poland. Okay? Poland had the Respublika, what was it called? They had a Respublika, I forget the other word, okay? Which was an aristocratic republic. And they never succeeded in setting up an effective government with a bureaucracy headed by a single ruler. It remained an aristocracy, the famous parliament, the Sejm, where nobles rode on horseback, okay, to show that they had no superior over themselves. But in theory, every nobleman, every member of the Sejm entering parliament on his horse could veto any decision. Poland never succeeded in developing a state, okay? And as a result, after 1778, I think it was, they were partitioned. They were partitioned by Frederick the Great, who, by the way, once said that Poland was like an onion, like an artichoke. You ate it one leaf after the other. By Austria, Hungary, and by Russia. So whoever did not succeed in building a state, a machine that was stronger and above all maybe more stable than individual rulers. Because individual rulers are always capricious. They change, they do this, they go that, they go mad, okay? They run after their mistresses, okay? The bureaucracy did not do all those things, or did it much less, much more stable, working according to fixed rules. To Russia, the state came late. Again, it is hard to say exactly when this happened, but you could argue that certainly not before the second half of the 19th century, when the serfs were finally set free. Before that, as you know, 1/2 of the population belonged to the other half. So it would be hard to say exactly, but probably the state reached Russia, like so many other things, reached Russia late, sometime around 1860. And even so, at least in theory, the Tsar, as you all know much better than I do, remained the autocrator, the only and autocratic and supreme ruler. In theory, he could do anything. Recently, I read Christopher Clark. Maybe some of you have seen the book on the outbreak of World War I. And of course, the Tsar played quite a role in that. No way could he do anything he wanted, okay? He was surrounded by his ministers, he was surrounded by his military, and he could not move a foot without them. Okay? Not even the Tsar of Russia. So by that time, the state had also reached Russia. Now, the original functions of the state before the state of government were laid down by the French political scientist Jean Bodin around 1576. Famous books, the 6 books of the Commonwealth. Les 6 livres de la République. And he says, the most important function of government is to lay down the law, to decide on war and peace, to raise taxes, to administer justice, to decide on the coinage, okay? These are the most important core functions of any government. And they remained more or less until the middle of the 19th century, when probably, among other things, because of the introduction of telegraphs and railways, which made it possible, made government much more effective on the ground, government started expanding. It took on gradually a whole series of other functions which it had never concerned itself with. It all happened gradually. So statistics, geographical office, health, education, welfare, okay? And later more officers, tourism, science, and so on, were added. And each expansion brought more bureaucrats, and each expansion made the state stronger and stronger. And this process went on, and also created a situation whereby the state took away more and more of the resources of society. And then, against the background of inflation, sometimes it's hard for me to realize how young most people are. But I can remember what was called during the 1970s stagflation, okay? Countries had a combination of very high inflation and stagnation and unemployment. And of course, it made people very unhappy. And so, around 1975, how should I put it? The ship was turned into the opposite direction. Under the influence of people like Milton Friedman, of course, like Ronald Reagan, like Margaret Thatcher, like the Chicago boys, and so on and so on, the state changed direction. It was decided that this could not go on. The bureaucracy just had to be cut. The percentage of people or resources working for the state had to go down. Privatization was everywhere. one of the countries most affected by that was my own country, Israel. Okay? Israel originally was a socialist country until 1946, until after a few years after World War II. Actually, you won't believe it, the Jewish community in Palestine was the only almost communist society outside the Soviet Union. Okay? And I can remember as a child, I was a child, we used to sing all kinds of songs in honor of the great Stalin. And we didn't know who Stalin was, okay? And there was one thing that ran like this. Stalin Avinu, Russia Imenu, Mi Yiten V'Hayinu Yetomim. Stalin our father, Russia our mother. We only wish we had been orphans. Believe it or not, and I was shouting it like everybody else. I didn't know what it meant, okay? But it didn't matter either. So, it was really like that. Israel was caught in this turnabout late, okay? 1985 or so, we finally also turned into the other direction. But before that, Israel was a socialist community, and in the years up until, let us say, 1948 or so, when Soviet Union took over Czechoslovakia and the other communist other countries in this Union, we were the only socialist country except the Soviet Union. It came to us late, but it did come, and it has been prevailing since, leading to very great prosperity, but also to quite some problems, as you may imagine, especially when we're talking about welfare. So since then, I would say this was the peak of state power. Okay? It has been rolling back. And there were several reasons why it has been rolling back. Friedman and the rest apart. One very important reason was that major war was becoming impossible. Major war was becoming impossible. You could basically only wage war between or against unimportant countries, if you will, like the Ukraine. Okay? And the reason why you could no longer wage war against important, powerful countries was obviously nuclear weapon proliferation. Now, as I told you earlier, I lecture all over the world. I'm lucky. I've been visiting the whole world, always at the expense of other people, which is nice. And very often I've said that, in my view, nuclear weapons are the best thing that happened to humanity in its whole history. Because with nuclear weapons, they can't end all kinds of wars, but at least they have so far put an end to the biggest, most bloody, most destructive wars of all, which is a lot, considering that your country lost about 40 million people in World War II. Nobody really knows, okay? If it had not been for nuclear weapons, then I'm pretty sure you, or rather the Soviet Union, would have fought the United States many, many years ago, and maybe not only once. Okay? But with nuclear weapons, as Mr. Putin's friend reminded us so kindly a few weeks ago, you just cannot. Now, whenever I say this in the West, people get very upset. Okay? Whenever I say nuclear weapons are the best thing that ever happened to humanity, how can you say a thing like that? And then there's always somebody who says, well, you're Israeli. How about Iran? Does that apply to Iran? I say, of course. Okay? Of course it applies to Iran. Okay? It applies to almost everybody. If you cannot fight it seriously, there is not much point in having a state, is there? Because the number one function of the state is to fight other state and to protect its citizens against it. It cannot do that any longer. And since it cannot do that any longer, it cannot demand the loyalty of the people. Okay? Why should they sacrifice themselves for a state which can no longer protect them? So, I might put it differently, what nuclear weapons really did, they took away what from the beginning of history had always been the most important function of the state, to fight other states. Oh yes, they could do so on a small scale on the border, all kind of skirmishes, but nothing serious. Since 1945, no nuclear power has had a real war 1,000 miles from its borders. Okay? You may be, and I hope it doesn't happen, but you may be the first if you're not very careful, and I'll come to that in a moment. Second, as the state bureaucracy retreated, many welfare benefits were cancelled. The welfare state, which had been built up beginning around 1900, okay, a little bit earlier in Germany with Bismarck, but beginning around 1900, started retreating. Welfare started providing less and less for people. And if everywhere almost, including Israel, and if this, and even in a place like Sweden, okay, the only place where they still have the kind of welfare system that they used to have 40, 50 years ago is Norway. And the only reason why they can have it in Norway is because, as you all know, it is floating on lakes and lakes and lakes of oil. They have oil coming out of their ears and all their other holes too. Okay? But even Sweden, okay, is no longer what it was 30 years ago. But if the state no longer looks after its citizens in the way it did, why should the citizens be loyal to it? It's a good question. Then there was globalization. It's very nice to have a state. But nowadays, I see the computers, I see the phones, okay? I came here by aircraft, okay? Probably nobody here who has not been in aircraft at some point and maybe flown abroad. We are living in a world that is increasingly dominated by, I think, the technologies of transportation and communication. And they, or the people using those technologies, have been running circles, almost literally, around the state. Because unlike the state, which has a territory, it has borders, it has an inside, it has an outside, they can go anywhere. They could go anywhere. It is just no contest. If Microsoft does not like the United States, they'll say, fine, we're going to England. The tax laws there are much better for us. Okay? And this is already, if I understand it correctly, getting to the point where some companies are beginning to set up their own states. Some of you may have read about Google building what people think is an artificial island in the Pacific Ocean where there is no territorial jurisdiction and where they can do what they want. Okay? They probably will not be the last if this succeeds. Okay? So, globalization is the third reason. The fourth reason is the partial breakdown of internal security in many countries. By that I mean, of course, the rise of terrorism. The rise of terrorism. And it is not just a question of terrorists rising. but of enormous private police forces and armies which are meant to protect those who can afford them. I don't know much about this country, but I can tell you that in England, in the United States, there are now, England, the home of democracy and freedom, there are now more private policemen than there are soldiers and policemen. Okay? And the same is true in the United States. Private police forces, private armies are everywhere. Not to mention the corporations which, in order to, for instance, dig for material in Africa or in Asia, have their own armies. Okay? And those armies mostly are made up of soldiers who received the training in the army, were discharged, and then were hired by those companies for 3 times as much money, but far fewer social benefits. Okay? So if, for instance, you were an American soldier, you served for 4 years, you served in Iraq, okay? And then after 4 years, you are discharged, and then you are rehired by Blackwater or some other, the hundreds of these companies, okay, in order to go on serving in Iraq. Okay, you do exactly the same work, only for a private employment. You get 3 times for that kind of money, but you do not get medical insurance. And you do not get retirement pensions, and so on and so on. So it fits exactly into what I've been saying. Fewer benefits, more money. And the final reason, I think, why the state is in retreat is because, frankly, not many people, as far as I can see in the West at least, and you can tell me, and I'll come to that in a moment, whether that's also true in Russia, people no longer care about the state. All they see, and they're quite right, is bureaucracy. Okay? People, I think, in the West have lost their belief in the state. The state at one time was an ideal. Well, many of you must have studied Hegel. I don't know how much Hegel you still study in this country. It was Hegel who once said that the state was the sound of the footsteps of God on earth, no less. Okay? It was the entity that gave meaning to human life. Okay? A meaning that went beyond the family and beyond the civil society. That made us into moral human beings insofar as it demanded and also received sacrifice. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, nowhere more than in this country, millions of people sacrificed themselves so that the state might live. I don't know about this country, but I can tell you that in the West, including Israel, although not quite as bad, but still, nobody is any more willing to risk his or her life for the state. Nobody, okay? Nobody. Only the other day I was talking to a German journalist who was saying to me about, all these tensions, Ukraine, Poland, Eastern Europe. The Germans won't fight for anybody. And since I visit Germany very often, I know he's right. Okay? The Germans won't fight anybody for anybody. No way in the world. Okay? They'd rather drown their grandmother than fight. Loyalty to the state, belief in the state has gone away to a very large extent. At best, it is seen as a necessary evil. At worst, as a bunch of thieves who want nothing better than to steal as much as they can for their own pockets. And if I understand it correctly, the recent vote in favor of the far right, what I call the far right, in much of Europe, is phenomenon, part of that. Yes, they hate immigrants. Yes, they hate the European Union, which itself, of course, is a bureaucratic monster. And they also hate the state, the bureaucratic state. Okay? And if they had their way and they won the government in places like France and others, Spain, the first thing they would do was to take all the state bureaucrats and drown them in the river, okay, if they could. This is a protest vote, and God knows where it will still lead. So these 5 factors: the death of major war, the retreat of welfare, globalization, the rise of terrorism and private forces to answer it, to deal with it, and the loss of faith. These, to my mind, are the reasons why the state is in retreat. Let me come to Russia. Russia only really started becoming a modern state, a state around 1860. Officially, it remained patrimonial until 1917, when you had the revolution. And then you tried to do all at once what it had taken other states maybe 2 or 3 centuries to do, maybe 2 centuries, 2.5 centuries to do, if you start with hopes. Okay? And to make the state into everything and incorporate everything into the state, and pulling yourselves up by your own bootstraps, like Baron Munchausen, because, as Lenin and Stalin and many others said, Russia had been backward for centuries. Hard to say why. If you ever saw Jared Diamond on that, he argues that it was the fact that you did not have a good access to the sea, and still don't, okay? I hope I'm not offending anybody, but I'm just quoting Lenin and Stalin, okay? Stalin said at one point that, I quote, Russia has always been backward. That is why we were beaten, first by the Vikings, then by the Tatars, then by the Swedes, then by the French, and now this was 1930s. He could not know that the next step would be Hitler. Or maybe he did know. We must make sure that this doesn't happen to us again. And yes, he succeeded in this, although at very, very high cost. You made yourself into a bureaucratic state par excellence. And that bureaucracy was, thank God, strong, as a Jew I can say this, strong enough to withstand the war, the Great Patriotic War, as you call it, and win it. Because if it had not been for you people, 3/4 of all the German soldiers were killed by you and nobody else. Okay? Then my people probably would no longer have existed, certainly not in Europe. But after Stalin's death, it started slowly disintegrating. And the gap which Lenin, above all, but also Stalin, had hoped to close, that gap started growing again. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew, until in 1989 to 1991, it all collapsed. And the collapse led to the near anarchy of the 90s. You can see how Mr. Putin is trying to rebuild the kind of mechanism that you had during the Soviet Union, slowly but surely. And makes you wonder, okay? Makes you wonder whether this is really the way to go. whether by limiting globalization, by going against what at least I see are the most important trends of the period. Now, I do not know what's going to happen in Ukraine. They have a civil war there now. It is not yet, thank God, very large, but it may become large and ferocious, and Mr. Putin and your forces, your armed forces and your country may have to intervene, not necessarily because Mr. Putin is a Hitler, which I think is nonsense, okay? And not because he's bad, but because if this really grows and lots of Russian people in Ukraine are going to get killed, he will have no choice. Okay? He will have no choice. And where may this take Russia? I know no more about the future than you do. But I'm a historian. I think I know a little bit about history. I hope so, anyhow. I remember, and some of you probably remember or have read about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay? And the role that Afghanistan played in that collapse. I'm not saying it was the only cause, but I think it was a very important cause. After 8 years in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union just did not have a military left. There was nobody who could hold the Soviet Union together. And if you are forced to intervene in the Ukraine on any scale, then I have no doubt that your armed forces could take over those two provinces there in the east very quickly. Question of weeks, maybe less. But what do you do afterwards? Can you really win the peace there? It's not Chechnya, you know, it's not such a small country. Can you put an end to the war there? Can you prevent this from becoming a long and very expensive guerrilla war? That very much remains to be seen. And so I must conclude on this note, okay? I hope very, very much that it does not happen, because you already have, as you know better than I, in the Russian Federation, about 25% by, you know, the CIA handbook says 23 and something percent, people who are not Slavic, okay, who are not Russian. Not all of whom love to be ruled from the city. So if that happens and you intervene in the Ukraine, whether you like it or not, okay? Because you may have to. This may end up really, really bad and perfectly in line, I'm afraid, with everything I have been trying to tell you today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking at your faces. I can see that some people have left. I'm sorry about that. But I think, as far as I can make out, you have been interested. It has been a pleasure talking to you. And if there are any questions, I'll try to answer them as best I can. Thank you very much.
What about the future of the state?
Pardon?
I'm sorry, but I think that you were talking on the different topic for the whole time, because the topic is the future of the state. In Russian, it is written here.
I'm so sorry.
Maybe you start from the...
You don't really want me to, but I've done that. But what I can do, if it's okay with you, I can add a few words about the way I see the future. Shall I? Okay. You see, in 1946, there was a guy called Henry Morgenthau, Jewish, of course. And he was a professor of political science, I think in Chicago, but I'm not sure. And he published a very famous book, this big, called Politics Among Nations. And this was the standard textbook that everybody used for about 20 years after that, a little bit more maybe than 20 years. Okay? Edition after edition. And if you look back on it, it's very interesting. The only organization, that kind of organization that he mentions, are states. Nothing else, not one word, not about churches, not about business corporations, not about NGOs, not about anything, okay? Not about terrorists, of course. Who thought about terrorists? The only kind of organization he mentioned were states. At that time, there were about 60, okay? About 60, just over 60. If you tried to do a book on international relations today, probably you would still start with states, wouldn't you? But at least half, and maybe more, would be devoted, at least if I wrote a book, to other kinds of organizations. I would be writing about the media. I would be writing about business corporations like Google, like Apple, and like Microsoft, and a great many others, multinationals. I would be writing about NGOs. I would be writing about terrorist organizations. I would be writing about all kinds, city-states like Singapore, okay? I would be writing 50% about of the whole thing would be about other kinds of organizations, which I think we'll all agree together influence international life quite as much, sometimes more, than states do. Some such organizations have much more impact on international life than the great majority of states. Okay? How many states can compete with Microsoft? How many states can compete with Samsung, with Apple, with Google, and the rest? Okay? In terms of power, in terms of resources, in terms of ability to decide what happens in the world, in terms of ability even to influence world politics. So my prediction about the future would be that we are in the midst of a process whereby the state is, or states are becoming less important, other kinds of organizations are becoming more important. Here in Russia, Putin is trying as hard as he can to roll the war back. And the question is, A, will he succeed? And B, what is the price all of you are going to pay? So this was very brief. I thank you for raising that question. I apologize for not having addressed it earlier, but this is how I see things.
Один потом, да, меня пытается